Neighbors laughed at her double barrel. Silas Pemberton, who had survived 8 Yukon winters, told her plainly, "A woman alone can't cut enough timber. You'll freeze, and that boy will freeze with you." She had $17, a 7-year-old son, and needed 6 cords of firewood she could not cut. On January 4th, 1898, the temperature plunged to 62 below in hours. But 3 months earlier, Elsa Varon had never built anything from metal in her life. She arrived at Lake Bennett on the 19th of September, 1897, and knew immediately that she was too late. The beach was already crowded with tents. Hundreds of them, maybe 1,000, stretched along the shore where the stampeders waited for spring breakup to float their boats to Dawson City and the gold fields beyond. Smoke rose from cook fires and tin stovepipes. The sound of axes rang through the thin air as men felled trees for lumber, for firewood, for the boats they would need when the ice finally released the lake. Elsa stood at the edge of it all with her 7-year-old son Jonas gripping her hand and their remaining supplies piled on a borrowed sled. 2,000 pounds of goods, flour, bacon, beans, tools, hauled over the Chilkoot Pass one backbreaking load at a time. Her husband Carl had collapsed on the final push to the summit. "Heart failure," the Mountie said. They buried him in a shallow grave marked with a cairn of stones that would be invisible by the first snowfall. Now she had the supplies, but not the man. The money, but not enough of it. $17.40 remained from the stake they had saved for 3 years in Minnesota. $17 to last until spring, until the ice broke, until she could reach the gold fields and find some way to survive. She needed shelter first. A cabin would cost materials and labor she could not afford. A night's lodging at one of the ramshackle hotels cost $2, more than a week's worth of food. That left the tent. The 12 by 14 wall tent they had carried over the pass, canvas so thin she could see her hand through it when held to the light. Jonas tugged her sleeve. His lips were already tinged blue from the wind coming off the lake. The temperature had dropped below freezing 3 nights ago and showed no sign of rising. Elsa found a spot near the tree line, away from the worst of the wind but far from the center of camp. She had the tent up by nightfall, working by feel as the darkness settled in. Jonas helped where he could, his small hands clumsy with cold, as they hammered stakes into the frozen ground. The tent was up, but it was not warm. She had no stove. The cheapest cast iron camp stove at the Bennett Trading Post cost $11. The sheet metal Yukon stoves that most stampeders used ran $8 to $15 depending on size. Even a battered second-hand unit sold for $6, and she had seen 2 men nearly come to blows over one that morning. $17. A stove would take more than half. Then there was food for the winter, kerosene for light, medicine if Jonas fell sick, replacement clothing when theirs wore through. The math did not work. It could not work. That first night she built a fire outside the tent and dragged heated rocks inside, wrapping them in canvas scraps to warm the sleeping blankets. The heat lasted perhaps 2 hours. By midnight she was awake, shivering, pulling Jonas closer to share what warmth their bodies could generate. By dawn, frost had formed on the inside of the tent walls. 3 days later, the first real cold arrived, 22 degrees below zero. Elsa woke to find Jonas's breath freezing on his blanket, small crystals of ice forming on the wool near his mouth. She could not feel her feet. When she tried to stand, her knees buckled from the cold, stiffened muscles, and she fell against the tent pole hard enough to shake loose a cascade of frost from the canvas above. She needed fire, real fire, contained fire, something that would burn through the night while she slept. That morning, she walked to the trading post and stood before the stoves lined up along the wall, cast iron, sheet metal, some with dampers and grates, others plain boxes with holes cut for pipe. The prices were marked in chalk on small wooden tags. The smallest stove was $8. She had 17. A man's voice came from behind her. "Looking to buy?" She turned. The speaker was perhaps 60 years old, with a beard gone gray and a face weathered by decades of northern winters. He wore a fur-lined coat that spoke of someone who had been in this country long before the gold rush brought the Chichacos flooding north. "Just looking," Elsa said. The old man studied her for a moment. Then he looked out the window toward the tent village. "Which one's yours? The patched one near the tree line?" She nodded. "Saw you come in 3 days ago. Saw the boy, too." He spat on the floor, a gesture of casual contempt that might have been aimed at her or at the situation or at nothing in particular. "Canvas tent, no stove, no husband from what I can tell. Winter's coming." "I know winter's coming." "Do you?" The old man's eyes were sharp beneath his heavy brows. "This isn't Minnesota winter, missus. This is the Yukon. Lake Bennett's bad enough, but come January, you'll see 50 below. 60 below when the wind comes down from the peaks." He gestured toward the stove display. "Even with one of those, you'll burn 6 cords of wood to make it through. Maybe 8. You know how long it takes to cut a cord?" She didn't. Also, 3 days of hard labor, a man's labor. Swinging an axe sunrise to sunset just to stack 4x4 by 8 feet of fuel. He counted on his fingers. 6 cords is 18 days. That's if you're strong, if the axe stays sharp, if you don't get sick or injured. A woman alone with a child? He shook his head slowly. "You can't cut enough wood to keep that tent warm, even if you had a stove, even if you worked yourself to bone and gristle." The old man stepped closer. His voice dropped. "Go home," he said. "Sell your supplies to someone with a chance. Take the boy back to wherever you came from before you freeze him to death in that canvas coffin you're calling shelter." The words hit like a physical blow. Elsa felt her face flush despite the cold. "I have no home to go back to," she said, "and I have no money for passage even if I did." The old man, Silas Pemberton, she would later learn, a veteran of 8 Yukon winters and 3 different gold rushes before this one, simply shrugged. "Then I'll see you in the spring," he said. "Or I won't." He walked away. Elsa stood alone in the trading post, staring at stoves she could not afford, doing math that would not balance, feeling the cold already seeping through the gaps in the door. 6 cords minimum, 18 days of labor, no stove to burn it in, and winter was 3 weeks away. The idea came to her on the 5th day, and it came from garbage. She was walking the edge of camp, looking for anything useful that others had discarded. The stampeders were wasteful in their haste, broken tools, torn canvas, bent metal, empty tins. She had already salvaged 2 dented kerosene cans, a cracked frying pan, and a length of stovepipe that someone had kinked beyond their patience to straighten. It was the kerosene cans that caught her attention now. 5-gallon tins, square-sided with a small cap on top for pouring. Standard Oil shipped them by the thousands to light the lamps of the world. She had seen them everywhere in Minnesota, in Seattle, on the boats coming north. Here at Lake Bennett, they littered the ground like strange metal flowers, discarded once their contents were burned. She picked one up. The metal was thin, perhaps a 1/16 of an inch, but intact except for the hole where the cap had been. She picked up another, and another. By the end of the morning, she had collected 11 usable tins from the refuse piles around camp. That night, with Jonas asleep beneath every blanket they owned, Elsa sat by the sputtering fire outside her tent and turned a kerosene tin over in her hands. She thought about heat, about where it went when a fire burned. In an open fire, most of the heat rose straight up and vanished into the sky. That was obvious. She could hold her hands above a flame and feel the warmth, but step 2 feet to the side and feel nothing. An open fire was a terrible way to heat anything except the air directly above it. A stove was better. The metal box contained the fire, and the metal itself grew hot, radiating warmth in all directions. But even with a stove, she had seen the smoke pouring from the pipes of her neighbors' tents. Gray smoke, thick smoke, smoke that carried unburned fuel up and away into the cold air. She had watched her father tend the forge in his blacksmith shop when she was a girl, watched him work the bellows, forcing air into the coals until they glowed white hot, watched the way the metal changed color as it heated, red, then orange, then yellow, then white. Watched the way smoke would sometimes catch fire itself if it passed too close to the hottest part of the forge. Smoke that caught fire. She turned the kerosene tin over again. Then she looked at the stovepipe she had salvaged, then at the pile of scrap metal slowly accumulating beside her tent. What if she could make the smoke burn? The thought was absurd. Smoke was what happened after fire, not before. Everyone knew that, but she had seen it happen in her father's forge. When the temperature was high enough, when the air was just right, the smoke itself would ignite in pale blue flames that danced above the coal. If she could trap the smoke, keep it hot, give it more air at just the right moment. She would need 2 chambers, one below for the fire itself, one above to catch and hold the hot gases before they escaped, a narrow passage between them to keep the upper chamber hot, and holes, small holes punched above the fire line to let fresh air in where it could meet the rising gases. Elsa looked at the kerosene tins again, 2 of them stacked, the bottom one for fire, the top one for the smoke that was not yet finished burning. She had no idea if it would work. The principle made sense in her head, but she had never heard of anyone building such a thing. The stoves at the trading post were simple boxes, 1 chamber, 1 fire, 1 pipe for the smoke to escape. But those stoves cost money she did not have, and even if she had the money, she did not have the 18 days of woodcutting labor that Silas Pemberton had calculated so grimly. If she could make the smoke burn a second time, she would extract more heat from less wood. The fire would last longer. She would cut less, sleep more, have a chance. The next morning, she began to build. Her nearest neighbor was a man named Thomas Creech, a former accountant from San Francisco who had arrived at Lake Bennett 2 weeks before Elsa. He had a proper Yukon stove, a canvas tent slightly larger than hers, and a wife who had died of pneumonia on the trail from Skagway. Creech watched Elsa work for most of the first day before approaching. She was cutting the top off a kerosene tin with a cold chisel and hammer when his shadow fell across her work. She looked up to find him standing with his arms crossed, his expression somewhere between curiosity and concern. "What are you making?" Elsa sat back on her heels. Her hands were already raw from the metalwork, and she had cut her palm on a sharp edge that morning. "A stove." Creech looked at the pile of kerosene tins, the salvaged stovepipe, the river clay she had dug from the bank and left to dry near her fire. "Out of garbage. Out of what I can find." He was quiet for a moment. Then he pointed at the 2 largest tins she had set aside, the ones she planned to use for the main chambers. "You're going to stack them?" "Yes." "Why?" Elsa hesitated. She had not tried to explain the idea to anyone yet, partly because she was not sure she could explain it, partly because she knew how it would sound. "To make the smoke burn twice," she said finally. Creech's expression shifted from curiosity to confusion to something that might have been pity. "Smoke doesn't burn. Smoke is what's left after burning." "Sometimes it does. I've seen it." "Where?" "In a blacksmith's forge. When the fire is hot enough, the smoke catches." Creech shook his head slowly. A forge is different. Those temperatures would melt this tin like butter. He kicked lightly at one of the kerosene containers. You can't get forge heat in a camp stove. I'm not trying to forge metal. I'm just trying to get the smoke hot enough to ignite. And if it doesn't work? The question hung in the air. Elsa knew the answer. If it did not work, she would have wasted days that should have been spent cutting wood. She would have no stove and no fuel. She would face the winter with nothing but heated rocks and desperate hope. Then I'll know, she said. Creech looked at the tent where Jonas was playing with a carved wooden horse, one of the few toys they had brought from Minnesota. The boy was bundled in every piece of clothing he owned, and still his nose was red from the cold. You're betting his life on this, Creech said quietly. You know that. Elsa did not answer. There was nothing to say. Creech turned and walked back to his tent. He did not offer to help. He did not offer advice. But she noticed that he did not laugh either, not like some of the others had when they saw her scavenging metal from the refuse piles. That night, the temperature dropped to 28 below. Elsa woke at 2 a.m. to stoke her outdoor fire and haul fresh rocks into the tent. Jonas never woke, but she could see his breath misting in the air, tiny clouds that formed and dissolved with each shallow exhale. She had perhaps 2 weeks until the real cold came, 2 weeks to build something that had never been built before from materials that were never meant for this purpose, based on a principle she had only observed and never tested. She went back to work at first light. Not everyone was content to simply watch. Marcus Holt ran the woodcutting crew that supplied most of the tent village with fuel. For $2 a cord, delivered and stacked, he and his 3 hired men provided the lifeblood of the camp. It was profitable work. The Stampeders were too busy building boats and dreaming of gold to spend their days swinging axes, and Holt was happy to take their money. He found Elsa on the 8th day, when her stove was beginning to take shape. She had cut and fitted the 2 main chambers, the larger kerosene tin below, a smaller one above, connected by a collar of rolled sheet metal. The lower chamber was lined with river clay mixed with sand, nearly 2 inches thick on the bottom and sides, drying slowly in the weak autumn sun. She had punched a row of small holes above the fire line, angled downward so the incoming air would swirl into the rising smoke. It looked like nothing anyone had ever seen. 2 metal boxes stacked vertically, bristling with patches and seams, ugly as sin and twice as strange. Holt stood over her work with his hands on his hips. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of easy confidence that came from knowing he was the strongest person in most rooms. What is that supposed to be? Elsa did not stop working. She was crimping a seam on the upper chamber, using a flat stone as an anvil and a hammer she had borrowed from a Finnish carpenter 3 tents down. A stove. That's not a stove. A stove has a firebox and a damper and proper pipe fittings. That's just... He searched for the word. Trash. It will work? Holt laughed. The sound was not friendly. Even if that thing doesn't fall apart the first time you light a fire in it, you'll still need wood to burn. 6 cords at least, probably 8 for a tent that leaky. He paused, doing the math that everyone in camp had done. At $2 a cord, that's $16. I hear you've got less than 20 to your name. Elsa felt her jaw tighten. The camp was small, and gossip traveled fast. Everyone knew her situation by now. The widow with the boy, the canvas tent with no stove, the $17 that would not stretch to spring. I won't need 6 cords, she said. No? No. Holt crouched down to look at her contraption more closely. His eyes traced the double chambers, the air holes, the clay lining visible through a gap in the seam. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter but no less hostile. Let's say this thing works. Let's say you burn half the wood everyone else does. That's still 3 or 4 cords. At $2 each, you're spending $8 to $12. You can't afford that either. I'll cut my own. With what? Those soft hands? He gestured at her palms, already blistered and cut from the metalwork. You wouldn't last 3 hours swinging an axe, and even if you did, you'd be taking business from me. There it was, the real objection. Elsa stood up. She was nearly a foot shorter than Holt, and perhaps half his weight, but she did not step back. I'm not trying to take anything from you. I'm trying to keep my son alive. And I'm trying to keep my men fed. Holt's voice hardened. Every cord you cut yourself is a cord we don't sell. Every neighbor who sees your little experiment and decides to try something similar is a customer we lose. He leaned closer. This camp runs on wood, Mrs., and I run the wood. So whatever you're building, I suggest you think very carefully about whether you want it to work. He turned and walked away without waiting for a response. Elsa stood among her scraps of metal and watched him go. Her hands were trembling from cold, from anger, from fear. She could not tell which. But she picked up the hammer and went back to work. The stove took shape over 11 days of labor. Elsa worked from first light until her hands could no longer grip the tools, stopping only to feed Jonas, to sleep a few hours when the exhaustion became too great to resist, to collect more materials from the growing piles of refuse around camp. The lower chamber was the firebox. 16 inches tall, 14 inches wide, lined with 2 inches of packed clay on all surfaces. She built a simple grate from iron barrel hoops twisted together, raised 3 inches off the bottom to allow ash to fall through. A door on one side, cut from the tin itself and hung on wire hinges, let her load wood and control the primary air intake. The upper chamber was smaller, 12 inches tall, 12 inches wide, positioned directly above the lower and connected by a collar of rolled sheet metal 6 inches in diameter. This was the reburn chamber. Hot gases from the fire below would rise into it, forced by the restriction of the collar to slow down and linger. The temperature inside would climb. And when it climbed high enough, she hoped, the air holes were the key. 8 of them, punched in a ring around the lower chamber just above where the fire would burn. Each hole was perhaps half an inch across, angled downward at 45 degrees so the incoming air would shoot into the flame zone rather than simply rising straight up. Fresh air meeting hot gases. The mixture that her father's forge had taught her could ignite. She had no damper for fine control, no thermometer to measure temperatures, no certainty that any of this would work. Just observation, memory, and the desperate logic of a woman who had no other options. Jonas helped where he could. He collected dry grass for tinder. He held tools when she needed an extra hand. He kept the small outdoor fire burning so she could warm her hands when they grew too numb to work. At 7 years old, he understood that something important was happening, even if he did not understand what. On the 9th day, the Finnish carpenter, whose hammer she had borrowed, came to watch her work. His name was Aino Koskinen, a man of few words who had built boats in Helsinki before the gold fever struck. He studied the double-chamber design for a long time without speaking. "You are trying to burn the smoke," he said finally. Elsa looked up, surprised. "Yes." Koskinen nodded slowly. "My grandfather built stoves in Finland. Very cold there, too. He talked about such things." He pointed at the collar connecting the 2 chambers. "You need it narrower. The gases must be forced together. More turbulence, more heat." He helped her rebuild the collar that afternoon, reducing its diameter from 6 inches to 4. It was the only help she received from anyone in camp. On the 11th day, she finished the stovepipe connection and sealed the final seams with a mixture of clay and ash. The stove sat outside her tent like some strange metal sculpture, 2 tin boxes stacked on legs made from bent barrel hoops, bristling with patches and repairs. It was not beautiful. It was barely functional in appearance, but it was complete. That night, she built the first fire. Jonas sat on a pile of blankets inside the tent, watching with wide eyes as Elsa loaded the lower chamber with tinder, kindling, and a few small pieces of split wood she had traded 2 days of food for. She left the door slightly open to allow air in, positioned the damper on the pipe fully open, and struck a match. The tinder caught. The kindling crackled. The wood began to burn. At first it seemed like any other fire. Heat radiated from the metal walls, not the intense heat of a cast iron stove, but warmth nonetheless. Smoke rose through the collar into the upper chamber and out the pipe. Gray smoke. Ordinary smoke. Elsa watched the air holes, watched the space above the fire where the fresh air entered, watched and waited. Nothing happened for several minutes. The fire burned normally. The smoke escaped normally. She felt the familiar sinking sensation of failure beginning to settle in her chest. Then the color changed. It was subtle at first, a faint blue tinge in the smoke just above the fire. Then less subtle. The blue deepened, spread, and then, with a soft whooshing sound that made Jonas gasp, the smoke itself caught fire. Pale blue flames danced in the upper chamber, visible through a gap in the seams where her crimping had not held perfectly. Flames with no wood beneath them, flames burning nothing but gas and air. The temperature inside the tent rose. Not by a degree or two, but noticeably, immediately, a wave of warmth that pushed back the autumn cold like a physical force. Elsa stared at her creation, at the blue-orange flames flickering where no flames should be, at the thin stream of smoke emerging from the pipe, far thinner than the gray columns that rose from her neighbors' tents. It worked. The smoke was burning, but one successful fire did not prove anything. The night stayed cold, 20 below by her estimate, and she fed the stove carefully, learning its rhythms. When to add wood, when to adjust the door, when to let it burn low to extend the fuel. By morning, the interior of the tent was still warm, warmer than it had been at any point since she arrived at Lake Bennett. She had used perhaps half the wood she would have needed in a conventional stove. The second night was colder, 25 below. The stove held. Jonas slept through until dawn for the first time since they had arrived. The third night brought the first real test. A front moved in from the northwest, dropping temperatures to 34 degrees below zero. Wind drove snow horizontally across the camp. Tents shook and flapped. Several collapsed, their frozen canvas cracking under the strain. The sound of chopping echoed through the night as men rushed to add fuel to stoves that could not keep up with the heat pouring out through canvas walls. Elsa's tent held warm through it all. But she was running out of wood. The split logs she had traded for were nearly gone. The scraps and debris she had scavenged burned quickly and provided little heat. She had perhaps 2 days of fuel remaining and no money to buy more. It was time to cut her own. She borrowed an axe from Aino Koskinen, who asked no questions and expected no payment. She found a stand of dead spruce half a mile from camp, trees killed by some long-ago fire but still standing, dry and ready to burn. The first swing nearly tore the axe from her hands. Her grip was wrong, her stance was wrong, everything was wrong. The blade bounced off the trunk, leaving barely a mark. She adjusted, tried again. The blade bit deeper, but twisted on impact, jarring her shoulders. Her arms ached after 10 swings. After 20, she had to stop and rest. 3 hours later, she had felled 1 tree. Silas Pemberton's math echoed in her mind. 3 days to cut a cord. A man's labor. She was not a man. She was not a laborer. She was a woman from Minnesota who had never swung an axe for more than splitting kindling, but she had no choice. She worked until dark, then dragged what she had cut back to camp on the borrowed sled. Half a cord at most. Her hands were bleeding through the bandages she had wrapped around the blisters. Her shoulders felt like they had been beaten with hammers. 6 cords minimum, Pemberton had said. Even with the efficient stove, she needed at least 3. That was 9 days of this agony. 9 days she did not have because winter was not waiting. She collapsed into the tent beside Jonas and slept without dreaming. The temperature dropped again overnight. 38 below. In the morning, Elsa heard shouting from the center of camp. She pulled on her coat and stepped outside to find a crowd gathered around a tent 2 rows down. A family had frozen in the night. Father, mother, 2 children. Their stove had run out of fuel around 3 in the morning. The father had planned to rise and stoke it, but never woke. By dawn, the temperature inside their tent had fallen to match the outside. By the time anyone noticed the silence, it was too late. The Mounties wrapped the bodies in canvas and added them to the growing row behind the trading post. They would be buried in the spring when the ground thawed enough to accept them. Elsa stood at the edge of the crowd and watched. The dead family's tent was the same size as hers. Their stove was a proper Yukon model, purchased new in Seattle. They had done everything right by conventional standards. And they were dead. The whisper started that afternoon. Someone had noticed that Elsa's tent was warm. Warmer than it should be. Warmer than the neighboring tents with their proper stoves and their conventional fires. Someone had noticed that the smoke from her stovepipe was different, thinner, cleaner, almost invisible against the gray sky. Someone had started asking questions. Thomas Creech knocked on her tent pole that evening. His face was haggard, his eyes red from smoke and lack of sleep. He had been stoking his fire all night, burning through his wood supply twice as fast as he had planned. "How did you do it?" he asked. Elsa looked at him for a long moment, remembered his doubt, his warning that she was betting her son's life on something that could not work. "Come inside," she said. "I'll show you." The stove was not perfect. The seams leaked smoke in places. The clay lining cracked when the fire burned too hot and had to be patched. The air holes clogged with ash and needed to be cleared daily. One of the barrel hoop legs bent under the weight, and she had to reinforce it with wire. But it worked, and word spread. 3 days after the family died, Elsa had her first visitor asking to study her design, then 2 more, then a half dozen. She explained the principle, the smoke, the temperature, the secondary combustion to anyone who asked. She showed them the construction, the clay lining, the air holes, the narrow collar that forced the gases to compress. Most did not believe it would work until she demonstrated. She would let the fire burn down to coals, add fresh wood, and close the damper until smoke began to fill the lower chamber. Then she would open the air holes, and they would watch the smoke catch fire. Blue-orange flames appearing from nowhere, heat increasing without additional fuel. Silas Pemberton came on the 5th day. The old man stood outside her tent for a long time, watching the thin stream of vapor rising from her pipe. Finally, he pushed aside the flap and ducked inside. The tent was warm, not merely survivable, but comfortable, perhaps 60 degrees despite the 30 below temperature outside. Jonas sat in the corner working on a piece of wood with a small knife, comfortable enough to have removed his coat. Pemberton studied the stove, walked around it, examined the seams, the air holes, the collar between the chambers. His face was unreadable. "You're burning the smoke," he said finally. "Yes, I've heard of such things." He shook his head slowly. "Never seen one work. It works. I can see that." He was quiet for a moment, still staring at the stove. "How much wood are you using?" "Half of what my neighbors burn. sometimes less. Pemberton did the math in his head. She could see him doing it, the same calculation he had made that first day in the trading post, now revised with new numbers. Half the wood meant half the cutting, half the labor, half the impossible gap between what she had and what she needed. "You might make it," he said finally. It was not an apology. Pemberton was not the kind of man who apologized, but there was something in his voice that had not been there before, something that sounded almost like respect. "I will make it," Elsa said. The old man grunted. Then he turned and pushed back out through the tent flap into the cold. But that night, Elsa saw him in the refuse pile near the edge of camp, collecting kerosene tins. By the 20th of October, she had cut 4 cords of wood. By the 1st of November, 5.5. Her hands were calloused leather. Her shoulders ached constantly. She had lost 15 pounds, and her face in the rare mirror showed a gauntness that frightened her. But the woodpile grew, and the stove kept burning, and Jonas stayed warm. Around her, the camp transformed. A dozen people had built copies of her design, with varying degrees of success. The failures were instructive. Stoves without clay lining burned through in days. Stoves with the wrong collar diameter never achieved secondary combustion. Stoves with too few air holes could not sustain the reburn effect. The successes were louder. 2 tents down, a couple from Oregon reported using barely 2 cords for the first month of winter. Across the camp, 3 miners pooled their resources to build a massive version that heated their communal cooking tent. A Norwegian sailor improved on her design, adding a simple damper mechanism that allowed finer control of the burn rate. Thomas Creech was not among the converts. The woodcutter watched the spread of the new stove design with unconcealed fury. Every tent that adopted it was a tent that bought less firewood. Every success was money out of his pocket. His prices dropped from $2 a cord to $1.50, then to $1.25, but still the demand fell. He confronted Elsa on the 3rd of November, storming up to her tent where she sat splitting kindling for the evening fire. "You're killing my business." Elsa did not stop working. "Your business was killing us. People need firewood. Not as much as you wanted them to believe." Creech stepped closer. His hands were fists at his sides. "Listen to me carefully. I have 3 men who depend on this work to eat. 3 men with families waiting for them in Seattle, in San Francisco, and Portland. You and your garbage stove are taking food out of their mouths." Elsa looked up at him. "And how many families froze in the night before I showed people another way?" The question hung between them. Creech's jaw worked, but no sound came out. I'm sorry about your business," Elsa said, and meant it. "But I'm not sorry about my son being alive. I'm not sorry about the others who are sleeping through the night instead of waking every 2 hours to stoke a fire that cannot keep up with the cold. I am not sorry for showing them a better way." She went back to her kindling. Creech stood over her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away without another word. That night, the temperature dropped to 41 below. And from somewhere in the darkness, Elsa heard the sound of someone chopping wood at the refuse pile, the same sound she had made weeks ago, collecting kerosene tins by moonlight. The camp was learning, the cold was coming, and the real test had not yet arrived. November passed in a blur of cold and labor, and the slow accumulation of fuel. Elsa's woodpile grew to 6 cords, then nearly 7, enough, she calculated, to survive until spring if her stove continued to perform as it had. The stove did more than perform. It exceeded every expectation she had dared to hold. On the coldest nights, when the temperature outside dropped to 40 below and the wind drove snow against the canvas with a sound like thrown sand, the interior of her tent held steady at 55 degrees, sometimes 60. Warm enough that Jonas could sleep without his coat. warm enough that she could work on mending clothes or repairing tools without her fingers going numb. Her neighbors noticed. The thin stream of smoke from her stovepipe had become a point of fascination in the camp. Other tents belched gray columns into the sky, burning through their supplies of wood at terrifying rates. Hers produced almost nothing visible, just a faint shimmer of heat rising into the frozen air. "How much did you burn last night?" Thomas Creech asked her one morning, the hostility in his voice replaced by something closer to bewilderment. Elsa checked the woodpile. "Perhaps 15 pounds. Creech stared at her. In his tent, with his conventional stove, he burned 40 pounds or more on a night that cold. The mathematics of it seemed to offend him personally. That's not possible. And yet, she gestured toward the tent, where Jonas was visible through the open flap, playing with his wooden horse in his shirt sleeves. No coat, no blankets wrapped around his shoulders. Just a boy in a warm room, as if the subarctic winter outside were happening to someone else. Creech shook his head and walked away, but the doubters remained. Silas Pemberton had acknowledged her success, but he had not declared victory. The Norwegian sailor who had improved her design warned her that the true test was still coming. "November cold is nothing," he said. "Wait for January. Wait for the deep freeze when the river ice groans and cracks and the trees explode from the cold. Then we will see what your stove can do." Elsa knew he was right. The cold so far had been severe but not extraordinary. 30 below, 40 below. Survivable temperatures for anyone with adequate preparation. January would be different. She watched the sky each morning, reading the clouds the way her father had taught her to read the signs of weather on the Minnesota prairie. High, thin clouds meant fair weather. Low, heavy clouds meant snow. And the strange, clear stillness that sometimes settled over the mountains that meant something worse was coming. On the 4th of January, 1898, the sky went still. The cold arrived without warning. One moment the temperature was 28 below, bitter but manageable. The next moment, or what felt like the next moment, it was 40 below, then 45, then 50. Elsa woke in the darkness to a sound she had never heard before. A deep groaning, almost like an animal in pain, coming from the direction of the lake. It took her a moment to understand what she was hearing. The ice was contracting. At 50 below zero, water ice shrinks. The frozen surface of Lake Bennett, miles across and several feet thick, was pulling itself tighter under the terrible pressure of the cold. The groaning was the sound of fractures forming, stress releasing, the frozen water protesting its own crystalline structure. She checked the thermometer hanging outside the tent flap. The mercury had retreated into the bulb and refused to rise, below the lowest marking, below anything she had a number for, 55 below, maybe 60. The stove was burning steadily, the familiar blue-orange glow visible through the gap in the seams, but the tent was colder than it had been in weeks. The canvas walls seemed to radiate cold inward, stealing heat faster than the fire could produce it. Elsa added wood, adjusted the air holes, waited. The temperature inside stabilized at 42 degrees, cold enough to see her breath, cold enough that Jonas pulled his blankets tighter and curled into a ball beneath them, but not cold enough to kill. Outside, the camp was screaming. She could hear it through the canvas. Shouts, curses, the crash of tent poles collapsing under loads of frozen fabric. Someone was calling for help. Someone else was crying. A child's voice, high and terrified, cut through the deeper sounds of adult panic. Elsa pulled on every piece of clothing she owned and pushed out through the tent flap into hell. The cold hit her like a physical blow. Her first breath seared her lungs. Her second breath brought tears that froze on her cheeks before they could fall. She had perhaps 5 minutes before the exposed skin of her face would begin to suffer frostbite, perhaps 10 before the damage became permanent. The tent 2 rows down, the large one belonging to a family from Kansas, had collapsed. The weight of frost on the canvas, combined with the contraction of the frozen ropes, had pulled the center pole sideways. Now the whole structure lay in a heap of fabric and broken wood, and somewhere beneath it, people were trapped. Elsa ran. She reached the collapsed tent at the same time as Eino Koskinen and 2 other men. They pulled at the frozen canvas with hands that were already losing feeling, tearing it aside to reveal the family beneath. The mother was conscious, but dazed, blood running from a cut on her forehead where the falling pole had struck her. The father was unconscious, pinned beneath a trunk that had toppled when the tent fell. 2 children, a girl of perhaps 10 and a boy younger than Jonas, huddled together, too frightened to move. "Get them inside," Koskinen shouted. "Any tent, now." But where? The neighboring tents were full. The occupants stood in their doorways, faces pale with cold and fear, unwilling to add 4 more bodies to spaces already stretched beyond capacity. Every additional person meant more heat loss to the cold. Every additional body meant survival became less certain. Elsa made the calculation in an instant. "Bring them to mine." The men looked at her. The Kansas father was a big man, perhaps 200 pounds, and unconscious. The mother was bleeding. The children were already showing signs of hypothermia. "Your tent is too small," someone said. "My stove is big enough." They carried the family across the camp. Elsa went ahead, pushing open her tent flap and pulling Jonas to one side to make room. The warm air that rushed out when she opened the entrance drew gasps from the men carrying the injured. "How is it so warm in there?" There was no time to explain. They laid the father on the ground, still unconscious but breathing. The mother sat against the tent wall, pressing a cloth to her bleeding forehead. The 2 children squeezed in beside Jonas, who stared at them with wide eyes but said nothing. 6 people in a tent built for 2. The temperature inside dropped immediately, 42 degrees, then 38, then 34, as body heat was overwhelmed by the new demand. Elsa fed the stove. She had prepared for this moment without knowing she was preparing for it. The woodpile outside held 7 cords, more than enough to last until spring at normal burn rates. But this was not normal. This was crisis. This was the deep freeze the Norwegian sailor had warned her about, the cold that cracked trees and killed the unprepared. She fed the stove everything she had. Split logs first, the driest and densest wood in her supply. Then the smaller pieces, the kindling she had been saving. The fire roared in the lower chamber, hotter than she had ever pushed it, and the secondary combustion in the upper chamber blazed with blue-white intensity. The temperature inside the tent stabilized, 38 degrees, then 40, then 42. Not warm, but not death. Outside, the screaming continued. The Kansas father woke after an hour, confused and disoriented but alive. The mother's bleeding had stopped. The children had stopped shivering and fallen into exhausted sleep, piled together with Jonas under every blanket the tent contained. Elsa sat by the stove and fed it through the night. She did not sleep. She did not eat. She watched the fire and listened to the sounds from outside, sounds that grew quieter as the night progressed, which might have meant that people were finding shelter or might have meant something worse. At dawn, the temperature outside had fallen to 62 below zero. Elsa knew this because Silas Pemberton told her. The old man appeared at her tent flap as the first gray light crept over the mountains, his face so wrapped in scarves and fur that only his eyes were visible. 62 below, he said. Coldest I've seen in 30 years. How many? She did not need to specify what she was asking. 4 dead that we know of. Maybe more when the sun comes up and people start checking on neighbors who didn't answer calls. Pemberton's eyes moved past her to the interior of the tent, the 6 people crammed inside, the blazing stove, the pile of wood beside it. You took in the Hendersons. They needed shelter. Half the camp needed shelter. You're the only one who took anyone in. He paused. Except you're running out of wood. Elsa looked at the pile. He was right. She had burned through nearly a cord in a single night, feeding the stove at a rate that could not be sustained. At this pace, her entire supply would be gone in a week. I know. You'll freeze before the cold breaks. All of you. Maybe. Pemberton was quiet for a moment. Then he unwrapped one of the scarves from his face, revealing an expression she had never seen on him before. Something that might have been admiration, or might have been grief, or might have been both. My tent is smaller than yours, he said, and I'm alone. I can burn less. He reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of paper. I have 2 cords stacked. Take one. Elsa stared at him. I can't pay. Did I ask for payment? Then why? The old man looked at the children sleeping in the corner, his own children, his grandchildren, the children of strangers, and something in his face shifted. Because I was wrong, he said. I told you that you'd freeze, that you'd get that boy killed, that a woman alone couldn't survive. He gestured at the tent, at the stove, at the impossible warmth in the midst of impossible cold. And here you are, alive, keeping others alive. He pushed the paper into her hand. It was a claim ticket for wood stored at the camp's central depot. 1 cord, he said, from a man who should have offered help instead of warnings. Then he turned and walked back into the cold. The deep freeze lasted 4 days. 4 days of 60 below temperatures. 4 days of feeding the stove around the clock. 4 days of 6 people sharing space meant for 2, breathing the same air, eating the same dwindling rations, waiting for the cold to break. On the 2nd day, Jonas developed a fever. Elsa noticed it first as a flush in his cheeks, unusual in the cold, and then as a heat when she pressed her palm to his forehead. His skin was dry and hot. His eyes were glassy. When she asked him how he felt, he said his throat hurt and his head ached, and he was so tired. She had seen these symptoms before. Scarlet fever had swept through their town in Minnesota 3 years ago, killing 2 children on their street and leaving a dozen others bedridden for weeks. The disease began with fever and sore throat and exhaustion, and it ended sometimes with death. There was no doctor at Lake Bennett, no medicine except what people had carried over the pass, no hospital, no clinic, no help. Elsa had willow bark, which her mother had taught her to brew into a tea for fever. She had honey, which soothed sore throats. She had blankets and warmth, and the desperate determination of a mother facing the worst. She could not take Jonas outside. The cold would kill him faster than any fever. She could not leave him to seek help. The only help available was already crammed into her tent, sheltering from the same cold that trapped them all. All she could do was keep him warm, keep him hydrated, keep the fever from climbing too high. All she could do was survive. The Henderson children caught the fever on the 3rd day. First the girl, then the boy, their small bodies fighting the same battle as Jonas. The tent became a hospital ward. 3 sick children, 2 frightened adults, and Elsa moving between them all, brewing willow bark tea and changing damp cloths and feeding the stove that was the only thing keeping any of them alive. Mrs. Henderson helped where she could, but her head injury had left her dizzy and unsteady. Mr. Henderson was strong but useless with sick children. He could carry water and fetch wood, but could not gentle a fever or soothe a frightened child. The labor fell to Elsa. She did not sleep for 70 hours. She fed the stove, she brewed the tea, she bathed foreheads and held hands and whispered reassurances she did not believe. She watched the thermometer outside the tent flap and counted the hours until the cold might break. On the fourth day, Jonas's fever broke first. She was changing the cloth on his forehead when his eyes opened. Clear eyes, focused eyes, not the glassy stare of the past 2 days. He looked at her and said, "Mama, I'm hungry." Elsa began to cry. She had not cried when Carl died, had not cried when Pemberton told her she would freeze, had not cried through any of the endless labor and fear and desperate calculation of the past 3 months. But now, with her son looking at her with clear eyes and asking for food, she wept. The Henderson children's fevers broke that afternoon. By evening, all three were sitting up and eating broth made from the last of the bacon Elsa had been saving, and outside, the temperature began to rise. The cold snap broke on the 9th of January. The mercury climbed from 60 below to 40 below to 20 below over the course of a single day, a temperature swing of 40 degrees that felt like the arrival of summer. People emerged from their tents blinking in the pale winter light. They counted the living and the dead. They assessed the damage, collapsed shelters, depleted supplies, frostbitten fingers and toes and noses. The final toll was 11 dead. 11 people who had not made it through the 4 days of impossible cold, frozen in their tents, frozen on the paths between tents, frozen in the desperate attempt to reach shelter that did not exist. 11 dead, and hundreds alive. Some of the survivors owed their lives to luck, a tent positioned in a sheltered spot, a stove that happened to burn efficiently, a neighbor who shared space at a critical moment. But many of the survivors owed their lives to something else, to a stove built from garbage, to a principle that most had thought impossible, to a woman who had shown them a better way. The visitors began arriving on the 10th of January, as soon as the temperature rose enough to make walking bearable. They came singly and in groups, stampeders and miners and families and loners, all asking the same questions. How does it work? Can you show me? Will you help me build one? Elsa showed them. She demonstrated the principle, the sealed chamber, the narrow collar, the air holes that introduced fresh oxygen above the fire line. She explained the clay lining that protected the metal and reflected heat inward. She walked them through the construction, the materials, the techniques. She asked for nothing in return. Thomas Creech came on the 12th of January. The woodcutter stood at the edge of the crowd gathered around Elsa's tent, watching as she explained the design for perhaps the 20th time. His face was unreadable. His men stood behind him, equally silent. When the crowd dispersed, Creech approached. "You cost me my business," he said. Elsa looked at him. She was exhausted beyond words, still recovering from the 4 sleepless days and nights of the deep freeze. She did not have the energy for another confrontation. "I know. 11 people died in the cold snap." "I know. How many would have died without your stove?" The question surprised her. She had not expected it from Creech. "I don't know. More." Creech nodded slowly. "The Hendersons would have died. Their tent collapsed. No one else would have taken them in." He paused. "My tent is 3 down from theirs. I heard them screaming. I didn't open my flap." Elsa said nothing. "You did," Creech said. "You took in 4 people you didn't know and burned your own wood to keep them alive." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. "I've got $17 saved. It's not much. But if you're teaching people to build these stoves, you'll need tools, metal, materials." He held out the pouch. Elsa stared at it, at him, at the man who had threatened her, who had predicted her failure, who had watched the Hendersons' tent collapse and done nothing. I don't want your money. I know. Creech set the pouch on the ground at her feet. Take it anyway. Consider it an apology. He turned and walked away. Elsa stood in the cold, looking at the leather pouch in the snow. $17, the same amount she had arrived with 3 months ago. The same amount that Silas Pemberton had told her could not possibly see her through the winter. But it had. She had. By the end of January, more than 60 tents at Lake Bennett had adopted some version of Elsa's double-chamber design. The variations were endless. Larger stoves, smaller stoves, stoves built from ammunition boxes and sheet iron and salvaged boilerplate, but the principle was the same. Seal the combustion chamber, install a baffle, punch air holes above the fire line, make the smoke burn twice. The mortality rate at the camp dropped by half. That single fact spread faster than any explanation of the physics involved. People did not need to understand why the design worked. They only needed to see that it did. They only needed to count the living instead of the dead. Aino Koskinen built a version with a water jacket that provided hot water for washing and cooking. The Norwegian sailor added a third chamber for even greater efficiency. A blacksmith from Oregon designed a cast iron version that he planned to manufacture when he returned home. Elsa helped them all. She answered questions, corrected mistakes, celebrated successes. She asked for nothing except that those who learned from her teach others in turn. By spring breakup, when the ice finally released Lake Bennett and the flotilla of homemade boats began the journey to Dawson City, the double-chamber stove had become standard equipment. The Stampeders, who had laughed at Elsa's garbage collection in September, were building their own versions in April. The skeptics, who had predicted her death, were asking for advice on air hole placement and clay lining thickness. The design would spread down the Yukon River to Dawson City and beyond. It would appear in mining camps throughout Alaska and the Yukon Territory. It would be copied and modified and improved by hundreds of hands that Elsa would never meet. She asked for no credit, took no payment, filed no patent. The knowledge was free because survival should be free, because the cold did not care about commerce or competition or pride. Elsa Varon did not find gold in the Klondike. She reached Dawson City in June of 1898, staked a claim on Bonanza Creek, and worked it for 2 seasons without striking anything of value. The gold that had drawn 100,000 people north proved as elusive for her as it did for most. But she found something else. In 1900, she married Aino Koskinen, the Finnish carpenter who had helped her narrow the collar on her first stove. They built a cabin together on the banks of the Yukon River, a cabin heated by a stove of their own design, larger than the original, more refined, but built on the same principle that had saved her life at Lake Bennett. Jonas grew up speaking 3 languages, English, Finnish, and the particular dialect of survival that the North demanded of everyone who stayed. He became a boat builder like his stepfather, crafting the vessels that carried supplies up and down the river. Elsa lived in the Yukon for the rest of her life. She died in 1931 at the age of 67 in the same cabin she and Aino had built 3 decades earlier. The stove that had heated that cabin, the 3rd or 4th generation of her original design, was still burning on the day she passed. The obituary in the Dawson City newspaper mentioned nothing about stoves or secondary combustion or the winter of 1897. It said only that she had been a pioneer, a survivor, and a woman who had helped her neighbors when help was needed. It was enough. 62 degrees below zero. That was the temperature on the morning of January 5th, 1898, when the deep freeze settled over Lake Bennett and the camp began to die. 62 below, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in minutes, cold enough to crack trees and buckle metal and turn canvas tents into death traps. Silas Pemberton had stood in the trading post 3 months earlier and delivered his verdict. "You can't cut enough timber," he had said. "A woman alone can't do it. You'll freeze, and that boy will freeze with you." He had been speaking from 30 years of experience. He had been speaking from the hard mathematics of wood and weather and human limitation. He had been speaking the truth as he understood it. But Elsa Varen had found a different truth. She had found it in the refuse piles at the edge of camp, in the kerosene tins that others had thrown away. She had found it in the memory of her father's forge, in the blue flames that danced above the coals when the temperature climbed high enough. She had found it in the desperate logic of a woman with $17 and a 7-year-old son and no other options. On the coldest night of the coldest winter anyone could remember, her tent had held warm. Not merely survivable. Warm. 62 below outside and 42 degrees inside, and a boy sleeping through until morning instead of waking every 2 hours to stoke a fire that could not keep pace with the cold. The smoke burned twice. The wood lasted twice as long, and Elsa Varen, who had never built anything from metal in her life, kept her son alive with a stove made of garbage and a principle that everyone said could not work. The stovepipe rose from her tent into the frozen sky, and from it came not the thick gray column of her neighbor's fires, but a thin shimmer of heat, almost invisible against the winter clouds. Almost invisible, but warm.